Good evening, everybody. Once again, welcome to the Milken Institute's Abu Dhabi Summit. My name is Hadley Gamble. I am the senior international correspondent and anchor for CNBC here in the UAE. And I have to say, I am thrilled to welcome a very exciting group of panelists to the stage. We're going to be talking about the 2020 election and its implications and meaning for this region, the GCC. Your Royal Highness, Prince Turki Al-Faisal, welcome. His Excellency Yousef Otaiba, Paul Ryan. Great to see you here in the UAE, as well as Christopher Smart. Gentlemen, welcome. I want to kick off by asking for a show of hands. Who believes US President Donald Trump will be reelected in 2020 in this room?
Wow.
It's a pretty significant show of hands.
Can we participate?
Absolutely. Let me see those hands. Interesting. Well, one. I want to kick off by asking you gentlemen to weigh in on who you believe is the Democratic candidate that poses the greatest threat to President Trump, potentially, in a general election. Your Excellency, if you want to kick off.
No, I think, well, first let's point out, we're down to 11 Democratic candidates from an original cast of 25. So there's still a lot of distance for the primaries to go. As we speak, the primaries in New Hampshire are ongoing. So it's still too early to tell, but what I see in the Democratic Party is a split between the moderate centrists, Democrats that we have known and worked with in the past, like Joe Biden, Amy Klobuchar, and eventually Mike Bloomberg, and the more progressive liberal wing that's further left, Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders. I think there's to put it slightly, a civil war inside the Democratic Party, and how that civil war ends, how it prevails, we still don't know. We're observing from a distance. Most people ask me what we think about the Democratic primaries, and I think most people in the Emirates really haven't tuned in. We're still very early on in the process, but whoever wins, at the end of the day, I can assure you that the UAE is going to work very closely with whoever the next president of the United States will be.
Spoken like a true ambassador. That's very good. That's why you have your job, isn't it?
Let's see how the evening goes.
Right. I guess I'll try and answer your question a little more narrowly. As a Wisconsinite, and I was a congressman from Wisconsin for 20 years, there are 3 states that will fight over to decide this thing. Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and we have to win one of those. Assuming the other states that we Republicans typically win, that I think the president will win. It's going to come down to those 3. So winning one of those, I think Wisconsin's probably the easiest one of those to win. And it was a very close race. It was less than 1 point in the last election. But it's been about a 1-point race for something like 3 of the last 5 elections in Wisconsin. I think Joe is probably the hardest to beat because it's going to come down to the suburban voter in what is my old congressional district and Jim Sensormeter is basically the Milwaukee suburbs. We call those the WOW counties. The Trump Republican is the blue-collar rural Republican. We used to call them Reagan Democrats. Donald Trump brought them into the party, into the fold. Then there's the urban voter that is a Democrat voter, a reliable Democrat voter. And then it's going to be the suburbanite that will basically be the difference maker. That suburbanite is typically a right-of-center, first-generation, college-educated, white-collar worker, first-generation Republican. And they like Trump the idea, they like Trump the disruption, they don't necessarily like the personality or the tweets or the noise that comes with it. So they'll be tempted to vote for what they think is a safe moderate, and I think Joe Biden, it's all relative, will fall into that category and is the likeliest to be able to win that voter. So I would say he's probably the most likely one to have a chance at beating Donald Trump, but I don't see Joe getting the nomination. I just don't see him getting there. So I think it's going to be one of these progressives, which I think will be much easier to beat. If Bernie keeps racking up wins and is seen to be going toward the nomination, then you could probably make a case that Bloomberg will get enough proportional delegates because he'll play in enough states to go into the convention with a claim, and then you'll have one whale of a mess of a convention in Milwaukee, and we'll see what happens there. But I don't see Joe getting the nomination, but I would say he's probably the best bet the Democrats have.
Your Royal Highness.
First of all, let me thank the United Arab Emirates for hosting us. What a wonderful place to be. And thank you, Sheikh Nahyan, for inaugurating us here. And of course, Mike Milken, thank you again for your invitation and your wonderful work that you do, not only in bringing us here, but what you do everywhere else. So again, thank you, Mike Milken. As an outside observer and a retired public official, I look upon American elections as a wonderful Bollywood movie. There's a lot of romance, perhaps, dancing and singing and treachery and bathos and pathos, you name it, they have it in there. And it's wonderful to watch. And I've been privileged to watch this since 1960. So good luck to all Americans for having to go through this every 4 years. But other than that, the Democrats have been beating themselves up so badly, if I can say that word. And whoever is going to be the last man or last woman standing, inevitably will have to be the person that the Democratic Party thinks is capable of beating Mr. Trump. I know from the hands that were showed when Ms. Gamble asked about Trump's being the next president, that that is going to be a difficult thing for any Democratic candidate to last and to be the last man or woman standing. But good luck to them. I'm not an expert like my neighbor here. His Excellency had told you all the different personalities that are playing on the Democratic side. But what I can say is it's an interesting lesson for us here in the Middle East. And we can learn a lot of not just what to do, but what not to do. So this is how I appreciate being on this panel and being retired so that I can say what I think.
Chris, you want to weigh in?
Well, I'm happy to weigh in. I think it is Tuesday night, and I think it's hard to remember back a week ago where we were still, where we continue to wait for the results from the Iowa caucus. I think it's important to remember the president has had an extraordinarily good week, and we've got a long way to go to November. So making predictions, I think we all need to do it with a certain amount of humility today. I think the confusion in Iowa points up a lot of the problems in the process. You know, there's still a lot of finger pointing going on. Was it the problem with the app? Was it the local officials? Was it the structure of the caucus itself? I actually got an email from a friend of mine from Moscow with a very wicked sense of humor who said, I just need to remind you that Russia has a long history of interfering in the Caucasus. Not many good caucus jokes, but feel free to use that if it comes up in the months ahead. I think the one thing that is clear is, well, I think if you look back, one of the best predictors of an election outcome turns out to be the S&P 500. In the 3 months before Election Day, if it is doing well, the incumbent tends to win and has won except all but 3 times back before World War II. If it doesn't do well, then the incumbent tends to not do well. I think we're dealing in a very different world in some ways because this particular incumbent is such a polarizing figure. And I think, you know, if the election is about the economy, clearly he should do well. If it's about him, then I think it'll be a different outcome.
It could, in fact, be about both, frankly. And I want to ask you, Ryan, about this specifically. Obviously, you were on the Hill during the financial crisis. You understand maybe better than most that it's really about the economy, stupid, when it comes to U.S. elections. Right now, U.S. equity markets are at record highs. And the analysts that we speak to on CNBC say, you know, we're really at the top of the cycle. You know, this could be as good as it gets. And when you take a step back and think about the fact that today they announced over 1,000 deaths due to the coronavirus, if this turns out to be a black swan market, a black swan moment for the market, what does that mean for the president's chances? If the economy's tanking, can Donald Trump get reelected?
I don't personally think it's going to tank like that. Can't predict an exaggerated shock like coronavirus, but putting that aside, we have the lowest unemployment rate since 1969. We have the lowest unemployment rate among African Americans, Latinos, and Asians in history. Wages are growing north of 3%, which is higher than inflation, so people are getting materially brought ahead. And the fastest wage growth is among low and middle income workers in America. This is a very good tailwind for the president. And putting something like an exogenous shock like coronavirus aside, he is going into this with a very, very good tailwind. He's going into this with a really good head of steam. And we don't see 2020 being much different. Frankly, you could argue the trade disputes took anywhere as much as half a point of GDP off the top. Those disputes are now at bay. We will not have trade fights like that in 2020, so we'll probably get that premium back. So I think he's heading into the election very well suited. He is getting the credit for that, frankly, because I think it's the policies that we had put in place that brought us this kind of an economy. And so it's going to be a personality contest. They're going to run a referendum on the incumbent based on personality, because it's pretty hard to run against the record of the economy. And I think he's very strong. And if he were to lose, it would be because of a really bad economy that tanked because of some crisis, or because Democrat successfully runs a personality contest against him. But it's really hard to run a personality contest against the president sitting on top of such a strong economy. And that's why I think he's going to get reelected.
And speaking of those unemployment numbers, I mean, you've got the strongest numbers since the Beatles released Abbey Road, just to put that into some sort of perspective.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that we talk about so often, particularly with business folks on CNBC, is how you hedge your bets. And I had the chance to catch up in an exclusive interview on CNBC overnight with Mr. Tom Barrack, and I asked him, a longtime Trump ally, there's not much he wouldn't do for President Trump, I would say, and I asked him, are you betting on the president winning in 2020? And he essentially said to me, I like Mike Bloomberg. He gave all the credit he could to the president for this economy, but he said, you know what? I like Mike Bloomberg, I respect him, he's a friend, and I think he would make a fantastic president. How would you describe what we're seeing in terms of that attitude, Chris? Because at the end of the day, is this businessmen hedging their bets, or do you believe that there could be a tidal change?
Well, so I don't want to speak for all investors or all business folk, but I will say, as much as I think investors have welcomed tax cuts and a deregulatory agenda, and that is clear in the stock market, I think the uncertainty around trade and the departures from traditional directions of American foreign policy have been generally unsettling to the international business community. And so I think they, as a group, struggle with that tension, in many ways would welcome the return to a more traditional president with a more traditional set of policies, even if it might bring with it a slightly less, a slightly more market regulatory agenda. I would say, those of us who've been in and out of government working in policy, and those of us who studied economics, it doesn't work this way in politics, but economics, the current economy has very little to do with the current president. Just as,
Don't tell him that.
And I would say that about Barack Obama. I would say that about George W. Bush. I think we're living, frankly, with an economy that happened because a lot of things that happened during President Obama's tenure. Unemployment came down dramatically, wage growth. The economy, frankly, is growing at roughly the same speed it was before. But economic policy takes root over many, many years. And what we're living with today has a lot to do with decisions of past presidents and Congresses.
I want to get to the foreign policy angle of this, but first, a quick question, Speaker Ryan. We look at the numbers right now heading into this New Hampshire primary, and at the moment, NBC data has said that it's pretty neck and neck right at the moment between Bernie Sanders and Pete Buttigieg. Do you believe America is ready for a gay president?
Ready for a what?
A gay president.
I don't look at it as ready for a gay president. I think if the Democrats putting their chips on a 37-year-old mayor of the fourth largest city in Indiana seems like incredibly risky to me, notwithstanding his sexual orientation. So to me, it would be a huge risk for the Democrats to put it on such an untested person, the presidency. And I think the
president didn't hurt President Obama.
Barack Obama's an exception. He really is. No, he literally, I think he's an exceptional, first of all, he was a U.S. Senator at the time. I ran against Barack Obama in 2012. I think he came in and people did not blame him for the economy because the economy blew up under the Bush administration. We were just talking about this here at dinner, and I don't think people held that against Barack Obama. I do think Donald Trump will get credit for this economy. I do think it's the policies. I differ a bit. I think it's the policies of the Trump presidency that largely brought forth this economic recovery we're seeing. But I can't imagine, maybe I'll eat these words, but I can't imagine Buttigieg winning this thing. I just don't, I think he would be somebody President Trump would love to run against. He'd prefer Bernie Sanders. We think we take the House if Bernie is the nominee. Our analysts would love to have Bernie Sanders as the nominee. As frightening as a possible presidency, a Sanders presidency would be to people like me, the upside is we would do really well in down ballot elections. Maybe Buttigieg would stem that, but I just can't see him beating Donald Trump.
Your Excellency, it's the year of tolerance in the UAE. Would the sexual orientation of a U.S. president have any bearing?
Absolutely not. No. We're going to deal with whoever wins the presidency, but I think the concern here is what would any of the candidates' view to this part of the world is, regardless of sexual orientation, age, or anything else. A good friend of mine a few months ago wrote an interesting article, and the title was, "The Middle East is being divided into red states and blue states." And one of the things I've seen in Washington over the last 10 or so years is the polarization of foreign policy. You know, whenever there was a handover from Democrat to Republican or vice versa, you know, the shifts we would see were more on domestic policy. We would see health care change, we would see immigration, or taxes go up, taxes go down. Foreign policy was largely consistent through Obama, Bush, Clinton, and Bush 41. What we're seeing now are more severe fluctuations of foreign policy, and the article essentially said that countries like the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Israel are essentially red states because our foreign policy leanings tend to be more aligned with traditional views in the conservative Republican Party, and Iran, Palestinian issue, democracy and human rights, those become blue states or blue issues. And what I think is more important and more dangerous than whether it's Buttigieg, Sanders, or Biden is the polarization of foreign policy, because this region looks at America then and says, wait a minute, if you're going to swing back and forth every 4 or 8 years, you know, that's not consistent. And if you're a country like the UAE or Jordan or Egypt, what we look for in a superpower, the most important traits in a superpower is reliability and consistency. And I worry that the U.S. is so polarized that your foreign policy is being impacted and countries here start to look at the U.S. a little differently.
Your Royal Highness. Yeah.
This is precisely what people like me are worried about, because I think there's a lot of truth in what Ambassador Otaiba just said. It's the point I tried to make earlier at lunch, which is all the more reason why we have to do everything we can to institutionalize our relationships. That's why the Middle East Strategic Alliance is all the more important, to have a security, economic, public-private cooperation that lasts beyond and spans administrations. The point I make as a person who ran the legislative branch, which is a separate but co-equal branch of government, but it's a longer-lasting branch of government, is that we have to do more. That's why I've been here, 5 times in the last 8 years with members of Congress to try and institutionalize this relationship so it can span parties and span administrations. All of us on both sides of the equation have more to do on that front.
I want to tap into His Royal Highness's depth of experience, not just as ambassador from the kingdom to the United States and the United Kingdom, but also as the head of Saudi intelligence for many, many years. When you take a step back and think about this within the breadth of history, we're talking about this kind of polarization. When you look at what's happened over the last couple of years, the first foreign policy trip of U.S. President Donald Trump was to Saudi Arabia. It was a break with precedent. There was a lot of media surrounding that. Obviously, there was a lot of excitement surrounding at that time Mohammed bin Salman's move to Vision 2030 and the diversification of the kingdom. Then we had several events that put Saudi Arabia very much on the back foot. The murder of Jamal Khashoggi, of course, was one of them. When it comes to the business community, what happened at the Riyadh Ritz-Carlton is another one. Do you feel that when we talk about this kind of polarization, Saudi Arabia has been unfairly targeted by members of the Democratic Party?
There is a definite media bias in general against Saudi Arabia. We are a monarchy. We are a Muslim country. We are trying to develop and go forward, coming from things like September 11th, where some Saudis participated in that situation. And as you said, the Khashoggi murder definitely had an impact on the image of Saudi Arabia. And the media has definitely blinkered itself to look upon us only through that spectrum, not what the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia stands for broadly. That we are a country that is trying to go forward, to improve not only the lot of our people, but to be a constructive partner for the United States in issues like Middle East peace, like meeting the Iranian challenge, and world stability and the welfare of the economy of the world. Let alone what is happening inside Saudi Arabia on issues of human rights and the youth progress, the role of women, etc. So yes, I would say that we have been unfairly targeted. But part of the blame I would put on ourselves. We have not been as open in the past as we are today. And I think we have learned from our partners in the United Arab Emirates that that is the way that we should be going. If anybody wants to come and see Saudi Arabia, come yourselves and see for yourselves. Don't wait for the New York Times or the Washington Post or whatever media outlet may tell you what Saudi Arabia is like. And this is why the visa for tourism in Saudi Arabia has been such a tremendous development for us. In 6 months since the visa issue was resolved, I think we've had more than 500,000 people come to Saudi Arabia. That is, from my perspective, when visas used to be, in my time as Director of Intelligence, very sparsely allotted to certain people and so on. It's an enormous sea change that has happened in the kingdom. And we have much to show the world, if only we had opened up earlier. But now we are opening up. And this is the time for all of you and anybody that is listening to us or watching us somewhere else, please take the advantage and come. And more particularly, I would love to see American politicians come and visit Saudi Arabia. You know, congressional leaders have not been to Saudi Arabia in many years. That is unacceptable. You have been.
I was there a year ago.
Yes, but others have not. And that reticence to come to the kingdom, I think, is equally unacceptable. So on both sides, we have to engage with each other and draw each other together. And rather than think of only our faults, we should also think of our merits. And this is where the media has been unfair to us. It concentrates mainly on our faults and never mentions our merits.
Chris, weigh in on this, because just a couple of weeks ago, or was it months? I think it was about a month. All my time runs together. I had the chance to catch up with President Obama's former national security advisor, Jim Jones, and I asked him how he would describe the president's way of governing, and he said, well, it seems to be governing by tweet. One of the things that we've heard from the panelists, obviously, is a worry about the polarization, frankly, of relationships internationally, something that the Democratic candidates have touched on several times in these debates. When you think about what happens next here with the divisiveness and the political discord that we've seen over the last 4 years, does that make America a dangerous nation abroad?
I don't think it makes us a dangerous nation, but I do think it makes us, I think the fact that we have made some departures from what has been a traditional series of foreign policy commitments through administrations across different political parties makes people wonder what's next. And I think that is, from my point of view, I think from investors' point of view, fundamentally unsettling, because investors like as much predictability as possible in a world that doesn't often deliver a lot of predictability. So I do agree with what my fellow panelists have said, that the more we can have a bipartisan approach to these things, the more we can have an institutional relationship. It was always an issue with U.S.-Soviet relations where Brezhnev and Carter were good friends and therefore things were going to go well, and then somebody else would come to power. You do need to create the institutional engagements, and so you have that predictability and reliability. I think particularly in the Middle East, you've had, with this administration, you've had departures on China, you've had departures on the tactics we've used to China. I think there's actually a lot of similarity between what we want China to do across Democratic and Republican lines. I think calling into question or raising questions about our commitment to NATO is not necessarily very helpful. You can agree or disagree about what's been done in the Middle East in terms of how the president is aligned, but he's aligned very clearly on issues around Israel, around Iran, around Saudi Arabia. I think there will, if there were a Democratic president coming to power, there would be some adjustment there. I'm not sure it would be a radical change, because when you get into office, you run on a lot of things, and then you realize that you don't have the money or the legal authority or the support in Congress, or you can't get it, you'll get killed in the press the next day. So I think there's a lot less room for maneuver than most presidents find when they get into office.
I just add to that, as far as Saudi Arabia is concerned, we've worked with all administrations since the relationship began in 1945 between a Democratic president, Roosevelt, and the late King Abdulaziz. And if you look at all of the administrations that we have gone through since that time, we've had our ups and downs, and we've disagreed. I remember during for example, the Truman administration, soon after Roosevelt died, we had the issue of Palestine that we disagreed about. And when Mr. Nixon, who was a Republican, we had the Ramadan War and the oil embargo.
I want to ask you about that specifically, because essentially your daddy, His Majesty King Faisal, was willing to go to war in the oil markets as a result of U.S. policy. When you look at what's happening today with the deal of the century, some people say it's a real estate ripoff, others say this is the Palestinians' last best hope to get a deal. That's something we hear from the business community, I might add. When you look at this and you think against the breadth of history here, the White House, the president calls a meeting to discuss the deal of the century. Beside him is Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel. His Excellency Yousef Otaiba is in the room. How did that make you feel?
Well, as I told you, Yani, we will disagree when there is a disagreement, but we will also put our hands together when there is agreement.
But is it a betrayal?
Well, you look at the present administration. Yani, we've agreed with them on their policy on Iran, but disagree with them on the policy vis-à-vis Israel and Palestine. And in spite of what everybody has said from the Trump administration about the deal of the century and so on, the kingdom and other Arab countries, including the United Arab Emirates, have taken a public position in opposition to that proposal that Mr. Trump has made, and will continue to be like that. So it's not just a one-faceted foreign policy agreement that we have with America. Things we will agree with and things we will disagree with.
Your Excellency, do you believe the Palestinians should negotiate?
I think if the two sides don't agree to sit down and negotiate, it doesn't matter how good or bad the deal is. At the end of the day, it's for them to hash this out. It's their deal. We can offer moral support, we can offer political support, but we can't decide this for anyone. And it's honestly not our place to judge whether the deal is good or bad before the two sides have had a chance to interact.
Do you think there's a hope in this deal?
I'm skeptical. I'm skeptical, but that's largely because I've been in Washington for almost 20 years. That's not because of a reflection on the deal. I'm skeptical because I see the polarization in Washington today that compared to 10 or 11 years ago when I first arrived, I mean, a couple things happened that just make me very, very concerned about the direction America's going in. There's a football player who protested, crimes in the United States against African Americans, and he decided to protest by kneeling during the national anthem. And in protest to his protest, because he had a Nike deal, they started burning their Nikes. That's because someone was kneeling during the national anthem, and people started going crazy because this guy was kneeling during the national anthem. The second thing that I was, I laughed at it because the owner of a fast food franchise in California called In-N-Out, I'm sure people know it, decided to make a donation to a political party in the United States, in California. And the opposing political party decided to boycott In-N-Out. We've gotten to a point where political parties are boycotting restaurants for political donations. I mean, that's why I'm skeptical, because if there's one thing America can agree on, or if anything that can bring the country together, it's that In-N-Out is actually a great burger. Yeah. And if you can fight over In-N-Out, if we can't agree on simple things like Nikes and burgers, then we're not going to have a chance of doing healthcare or immigration reform on a bipartisan basis. So, again, whether you're looking and judging the deal itself, the political environment we are in is so polarized that I'm skeptical of make significant progress on any of these things.
Speaker Ryan, you know the U.S. public pretty well by now. How concerned are you that the United States, given the fact that we're in the middle of an election cycle, doesn't seem to realize how much is at stake when it comes to this deal or no deal for this region?
Well, let me try and give you a better glass half full side of this, because I think Yousef captured it well. As far as the Palestinian issue, you're exactly right. When they choose to have a deal, they'll have a deal, and not before. So I'm not going to hold my breath. But on American politics, it will get worse before it gets better, because we're in a presidential election year. And it's a presidential election year with an incumbent president. So the supporters of the president get animated, the opponents get animated. And this one's going to be even more because we're in this digital age of Twitter, and the president has a very unique style and personality that really, gets people animated. But in just the last 2 years, in the past session of Congress, and I mentioned this at lunch, the typical session of Congress passes in its 2-year period about 500 pieces of legislation. In the past session of Congress, we passed 1,178. 600 of them made it into law. And these are major, major pieces of legislation. Overhauling our entire approach to curing cancer, going after the opioid crisis, overhauling the entire career and technical education system to close the skills gap, 17 major regulatory relief measures, from banks to oil and gas to small businesses. We rewrote the tax code for the first time since 1986. I can go on and on and on. There are a few things that we didn't, which we should have done, like immigration. Over 80% of all of those pieces of legislation in the most productive Congress in a generation were bipartisan. We rebuilt our water infrastructure. We built our air infrastructure. All those things I just mentioned, with a couple of exceptions, Republicans and Democrats worked together, compromised, passed legislation, they became law. Here's the problem. In our society, in our media these days, nobody knows these things happened. Nobody knows this stuff happened, because the only thing that really sells is when we're at each other's throats. It's hits, it's clicks, people go and camp out in their own cul-de-sac. If you hate Trump, you watch MSNBC or CNN. If you love Trump, you watch Fox. You go to your website, you go to your newspaper, you go to your TV, your radio, to hear confirmation bias, what you want. And that is a new challenge in society that we're going to have to get our hands around. But the institutions still work. The separation of powers still works. Congress still functions. Laws still get written. Compromises still occur. Things still happen. So even though there's a lot of hyperbolic polarization out there, the place still operates and functions.
Just going to add something. I think President Trump largely ran and won an election based on the platform that he's a disruptor. That he's going to come in, he's an outsider, he's going to fix all the problems in Washington, and whether you like him or not, he delivered on a lot of his campaign promises. Chris mentioned there's a desire to return to a more traditional presidency, and I think ultimately that's the question for the American voter in 2020. Does the country want to go back to a traditional presidency, or do they want to stick with a disruptor who communicates via social media?
Would it be easier for you?
I think we are not the issue. We're going to work with anyone.
You can't ask an ambassador that question. You can't.
I talk to as many Democrats as I do Republicans, and I really believe that there is a fight over the soul of the Democratic Party, and that has nothing to do with the UAE. I think the Democratic Party needs to figure that out and then understand what role America should play in the world, what role it should play in the United States, and what its policies are. That's something we cannot get involved in.
But if you roll back the dial and you look at the policies of the Obama administration, you had the pivot to Asia, you had the red line, we were talking about this off stage, and you have the idea that that really kick-started the move of so many governments in this part of the world toward a more definitive foreign policy, that they were going to have to take that as a result of the fact that they didn't feel the Obama administration was making clear assessments and clear declarations of where they stood on things. So isn't it easier if you've got a president that says, hey, listen, whether you like me or not, this is what I think and this is what we're going to do?
The truth is that there's a strain of isolationism in both the Trump administration and the Obama administration, and it's driven by a Middle East fatigue that has seen 18 years in Afghanistan and, 12 years in Iraq. The American public is kind of tired and sick of the Middle East. That's a true reality. It's reflected in polls. There was a panel here last week that a good friend of mine sat on, and he basically said, the truth is American public thinks they're just not that into you anymore. They're tired of this region. There's no big wins that, the U.S. has had in this region in a while. And so, we're moving on. And I said, that's fine. You have every right to feel that way, for your policies to be that way. But then we can see other people. If we're not going to be in an exclusive relationship.
An open relationship.
Right?
How interesting.
It's true. I think there's difficulty in people getting their head wrapped around, well, you guys are on your own. We're tired of this place. Okay, well, we're going to go talk to some other people here while you're preoccupied. I think America is going through a moment where it's self-absorbed, and they need to figure out what America's role in the world should be.
Okay, so the JCPOA is over. It was over the moment that President Trump actually came to the White House. Right now, you've got Iraq in turmoil. You've got Lebanon in fiscal collapse, social and economic collapse. The Persian Gulf, perhaps at no time since the Gulf War has it had such a heavy international coalition patrolling those waterways, very important, obviously, to oil markets. Maximum pressure, by all accounts, seemingly to be finally having an effect on Iran, their policies in the region. What's the path to re-engagement here? And anyone can pick this one up.
Can you repeat the question?
What's the path to re-engagement when it comes to Iran?
Well, Iran has to show goodwill. Basically, they're the ones who are the troublemakers. If I can just remind you, Iran was the one who started embassy hijacking in 1979. And they continued on a path of provocation since that time. More recently, of course, the attacks on the tankers in the Arabian Sea and the Gulf, then the attacks on the Aramco installations, as if they're telling everybody, we're doing it, and let's see if you can come up to face us. So it is that kind of attitude that Iran has to change. They have to start thinking that they want to be a constructive partner in the Middle East, not someone who is seeking hegemony over countries. Look what they're doing in Iraq today. They're actually urging their supporters in Iraq to beat up on the peaceful demonstrators that are going down in the streets. It is that kind of action that is really not only provocative, but destructive. And that's why you have these resistance movements now to Iran that have grown in Iraq and in Lebanon, where the people have felt the weight of Iranian intervention and the Iranian oppression of their own people. So Iran has to change its attitudes, not the rest of the world. And that is something, I think, where the world has to understand that we are next door to Iran. We're not 3,000, 4,000 miles away, and we're the ones who are immediate victims of their provocations, i.e. the attack on the Aramco oil facilities. That was clearly an Iranian provocation against us. Fortunately, we have leadership that is willing not only to play cool with such situations, but to look to the future rather than to engage immediately in retaliation and warmongering and provocation. So this is what Iran has to change. And I will just go with His Excellency the Ambassador's talk about the Middle East and American tiredness of being in the Middle East and so on. What happens here doesn't stay here.
That's right.
And this is where we've seen examples of that.
That's right.
Bush orders withdrawal of American troops, and in a year or two, there is the surge. Obama withdraws troops, and then he puts them back. Trump takes out troops, and then he puts them back. So it is that kind of engagement. So just admit it, America. You need us as much as we need you. So let's get over.
Speaker Ryan, I want to follow on to that one because obviously, you know, I've been out here for a decade and I was reporting at the moment they opened up the Aramco facility to get in there and see that damage. We were live and on the ground talking about that, communicating what was happening to the markets, to investors. I have to ask you, when you think about this a bit more broadly, thousands of U.S. troops headed immediately, President taking a quick decision that it was important to protect Aramco facilities, protect the oil supplies. Frankly, those oil supplies, most of that oil was going to Asian markets. Is there a danger when the president talks about energy independence? It's a myth, because as much as the United States has made so many strides in terms of shale and fracking and the ability to kind of call their own destiny, it is a myth. We are not energy independent, no matter what the president says. Is there a danger there in communicating that to the American voter when you're talking about putting blood and treasure, trillions of dollars in the Persian Gulf, into Saudi Arabia, when all of those oil supplies going to Asian markets, that at some point the American voter with this kind of Middle East fatigue is going to say, hey, listen, why are we doing that? Because it's a heck of a lot of money and it's putting potentially thousands of Americans in danger. Is that rhetoric dangerous?
If we made it about oil, then it would be, but we cannot make this case about oil because it's what His Highness said. It's more than oil. It's about very important relationships and partnerships and alliances that run deep, that need to continue. And it is a small world, and these problems run around the world. So it's about de-radicalization. It's about education. It's about alliances and prosperity. And frankly, with respect to oil, I negotiated the repeal of the export ban on oil with President Obama in 2015. Then we passed a bunch of regulatory reforms for fracking. And since 2015, when we could not export oil, we're now the #1 exporter in the world of oil and gas. I don't think we have changed codependency as much as we've changed the price. And I don't think you're going to see massive price shocks. I mean, after the Soleimani strike, it went $3 a barrel for a day, maybe, something like that. So I think what we've achieved with our policies, we've contributed to achieving, is just tightening the band of price, which is good for consumers. So this is not about oil. This is so much more important than that. It is about the fact that we are in this together. We are allies. Yes. We see the Iran threat the exact same way. Absolutely. And that is really more important. So Iran, the biggest terrorist sponsor in the world, they're making mischief through their proxies against us, you, and everyone else. And that is what this is more about than oil. So in the case we make to our, I've been in Congress for 20 years. I voted for the Iraq, I voted for Afghanistan, I voted for all of these things. I've been going to these countries for years. The case I make to my constituents has never been about oil, but about our safety and our security, about making sure that we address these problems so that we do not have this come into our communities on our doorstep. It's about national security. It's about economic security. It's not about oil.
And terrorism. Terrorism is a binder for all of us. Point. And if we don't meet it and face it together, it's going to take us apart by ourselves. So that's another subject that we have to cooperate with the United States on.
So 2 successive U.S. administrations coming into office talking about rolling back the U.S. presence in the Middle East. So far, they've failed. Chris, when you take a step back and think about this within this trajectory of where we're going,
I think that's what's important to keep in mind, or to try and keep in mind, which is, first of all, when I was mentioning the importance of stability or a return to a more traditional foreign policy, I don't know if that's important to American voters. I think it's important to investors globally, was the point I was trying to make. I think we'll see what is important to American voters in the fall. But I think if you take a step back and look at this more historically, there's some weird tensions going on within the Democratic Party and within the Republican Party. A lot of isolationist sentiment in some parts of the Democratic Party and some parts of the Republican Party. A lot of more progressive Democratic candidates talking about the importance of our alliances, of our role in the world, of the importance of multilateral efforts, which is not something you would have expected from a traditional progressive Democratic candidate. And a president who is in some ways very engaged in other parts of the world, but in running on a bumper sticker of America First, which is also a kind of a strange. And I think if you go back through history, Democrats used to be the party of free trade and then shifted, and Republicans were more protectionist and shifted. We may be at a moment in history where there's going to be a lot more fluidity across the American political spectrum, which doesn't necessarily make it easier for investors or for diplomats or for public officials. But I think those are the kinds of fluidities that we're now seeing in both markets and polls.
I'm no longer a diplomat, so don't point at me, please.
You're a very wise man.
Excellency.
Two quick points. I think to address the Middle East fatigue, which is real, which actually exists, I have seen a failure at the national level, and I think Speaker Ryan deserves a lot of credit because he's actually one of the few people that goes out and makes this case consistently. But at the national level, President Trump, President Obama, and several others have not made the case of why this type of engagement in this part of the world is in America's interest. I can't remember a president getting up and giving a speech of why engaging in the Middle East is good for America. And the flip side of that, 20 years ago, we were largely a beneficiary of American regional presence. We are now a contributor to stability in the region. We benefit from the U.S. presence here, but we also contribute to it, whether it's in coalitions, whether it's in investments, whether it's in counter-piracy, whether it's in counterterrorism operations in a lot of places in the region. And this is our job. Like, we have to do a better job of explaining that to the American people, but also it's important for American leaders to go up and say, this is why this is good for America.
How dangerous is it if you get that messaging wrong? Because, to my previous question, at the end of the day, we're seeing activist voters in a way that we haven't seen before. We're talking about populism across the world. Getting the message wrong to the American public can be incredibly dangerous, perhaps, for this part of the world. And at the end of the day, when you take a step back and realize that the oil is going to Asian markets, not necessarily to the United States, this idea of American energy independence, at some point people might just say, why are we spending all this money and sending Americans over to the region to protect sources of energy we don't actually need? How dangerous is that messaging?
Again, because this is about counterterrorism. This is not about oil. So it's counterterrorism.
Well, they're intertwined.
Sure, but it's really about counterterrorism. People have long memories in America, and they realize there is a terrorist threat that comes from the region, and that has to be addressed. And this is why I say let's hug the problem and run at this challenge together. The UAE has a world-class military. You have built up a really capable military. This is something to be celebrated. This is something that we want to embrace. This is why we should also have a trade agreement with the UAE and with Saudi Arabia. We should do more. And if we have a more robust relationship as peers, where not just government to government, and take it from our politicians who say their politicians are good and we're having a good relationship. Let's have our companies, let's have our people, let's have exchanges, let's have come to our universities. We want to come to yours. We need more cultural exchange, more business agreements, more business relationships, so that the people know each other. And that is why I say we got to go grab this.
Yeah.
We have to work toward this and institutionalize this relationship, so it's not just between political leaders.
We're kind of running from behind though at this point, because obviously the biggest foreign investor in the UAE is China. But no, I think it's backwards. I think the U.S. was largely here unchallenged for many years. I think some new players are getting involved,
And U.S. government does not do a fairly good job of promoting U.S. businesses.
Yeah.
But U.S. businesses need to take the lead and understand that there is significant competition that didn't exist 4 or 5 years ago.
You know, Hadley, when you talked about populism, no one was more engaged and enamored of populism than some of the Arab leaders in our historic background. And look what happened to their countries. They all drove their countries to the pits. And so, warning to all those who try populism, you're going to drive your countries down. Give it up. Be more civil and more engaged with everybody else. That is the message I think that all of us have to acquire and nourish and nurture. Enough of this sloganeering and hate speech and so on, not just in America, but even here.
Your Excellencies, Your Royal Highness, gentlemen, I'd love to see some women on this stage. Thank you so much for joining us. Everyone have a good evening.